Recently, we talked about how the Chinese government is using facial recognition software to racially profile Uyghurs, the Muslim ethnic minority who predominantly live in Xinjiang province. And then the New York Times ran a story about how $60 in a slow news day was all it took to build a fairly accurate facial recognition machine, as creepy as it is legal. And then I boarded a JetBlue flight to Mexico, and instead of scanning my boarding pass, they scanned my goddamn face. I tweeted about it, and then Edward Snowden retweeted it with the comment, "This is only the beginning." We welcome back the crew to talk about our dystopian present. Welcome, you guys. Do you want to introduce yourselves to our viewers? Shireen, maybe we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mackenzie. I'm Shireen Bargi. I'm one of the producers of the show, and thank you for having me.
Of course, Isabel.
Hi, I'm Isabel Alcantara, and I'm the associate producer.
And Myra.
Hi, I'm Myra Al-Rahim, and I edit the podcast for 112BK.
Thanks for coming back, you guys. So we've been on hiatus, so it's good to see you guys again.
Hello.
And in the interim, this kind of weird thing happened, which is that I tweeted about this JetBlue experience, and it went, as they say, as the young people say, viral. So I'm just wondering, maybe for people who have not seen this tweet, maybe we can do a dramatic reenactment. Shireen, do you want to play JetBlue customer service?
Of course.
Okay.
Always.
So I tweeted, here's my first tweet. I just boarded an international JetBlue flight. Instead of scanning my boarding pass or handing over my passport, I looked into a camera before being allowed down the jet bridge. Did facial recognition replace boarding passes unbeknownst to me? Did I consent to this? And then JetBlue says,
You're able to opt out of this procedure, Mackenzie. Sorry if this made you feel uncomfortable.
oh my God, your American accent is so good. That's such a classic, like, non-apology apology, right?
Oh,
like,
yeah, no.
I'm sorry this made you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So then I said, follow-up question, presumably these facial recognition scanners are matching my image to something in order to verify my identity. How does JetBlue know what I look like?
The information is provided by the United States Department of Homeland Security from existing holdings.
And this is when I flipped the fuck out. I said, so to be clear, the government provided my biometric data to a privately held company? Did I consent to this? How long is my data held by JetBlue? And even if I opt out at the scanners, you already have my information, correct?
We should clarify, these photos aren't provided to us, but are securely transmitted to the Customs and Border Protection database. JetBlue does not have direct access to these photos and doesn't store them.
So that to me is like the backpedal of all the backpedals, right? Like I wonder if a supervisor was like, "Oh no, we can't."
She's actually angry.
Yeah, we can't say that.
Can't say that.
Right?
We can't be like, yes, no.
Right. Oh,
We-
actually, we
We
just
don't-
kidding.
No.
Yeah.
The facial, it doesn't even work. It's just a charade.
Right. It's not a real camera.
It's not a real camera. No,
that's
it's just
your
a
price.
It's just a mirror.
Yeah. It did look remarkably like me. Okay, so then I said, would love more info about how my image was matched to a name on the flight manifest. I looked at the camera, and a few seconds later, the gate opened. Was my image in the space of those seconds sent to CBP, run through a database, matched to a name, and then sent back to JetBlue?
You're quite the investigator, Mackenzie.
Thank you.
You're really asking the
thank
right
you.
questions
No.
here.
It's almost like I'm a
She's a
journalist,
journalist,
on this.
you guys.
Almost.
Almost like she's a
You
journalist.
should be a journalist.
Thanks,
Should
you
do this
guys.
for a living.
And I think they give up here because they're like, here's a link.
So that link, it says JetBlue gives me a link to a press release. That is like so bogus. It's
Oh
just
my
like,
God,
and it's all about
Bobo.
how this is like going to be like convenient to people who fly because now you can just like go
Oh,
right through.
great.
And so then I quote a line from the press release. Quote, there is no pre-registration required. I'll say this press release really doesn't tell me anything about how it works. EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, can you shed some light on this? How concerned should I be?
Did they? Did they shed light?
They did. They tweeted later and they were like, really fucking concerned.
Okay, great.
And they linked to some articles. So wait, but then JetBlue's not done. JetBlue says something else.
JetBlue basically we found another article that might be interesting to you. It talks a bit about the data and how it's processed.
And in their defense this time, they linked to a WBUR article. So this is like actual reportage by NPR that looks at both sides of it. And so again, I sort of quote a line from this piece. It says, it took her photo comparing her picture to a preloaded photo database of all the passengers with tickets on this flight. It sounds like opting out isn't really an option. I cannot go through the scanner, but my data will already have been accessed and loaded into a database. So that was the end of that discussion.
I hate that.
Yeah. How do
I
you
hate
feel
that.
about it? Tell me why.
I hate that a lot. I don't think any privately held company should have access to DHS anything. I think you give your information, like including your passport number and everything, willingly when you book the ticket. I don't understand why anything more than that is necessary. And this is coming from someone who gives biometrics on the regular, because I do come through the border as a Mexican citizen and I have to give my fingerprints, and they do take a picture of me every time I go through. But that's at the immigration checkpoint, which is, like at that point, you're like, yeah, this is a person with a badge, with a secure system computer, as secure as like government systems can be, I guess. But it's not a company where someone has to make a profit. And already that poses a conflict for me.
Totally. And I think that was curious about why they backpedaled, because first they were like, oh, this is just like JetBlue speeding up the process. And then they were like, wait, it's not JetBlue. It's not JetBlue. It's actually CBP. And if that's true, there was absolutely no signage that suggested that. Like, it very much felt part of the JetBlue boarding process. And like similarly to you, you know, I joined Global Entry. I have TSA PreCheck. Like, I made the decisions for myself that I would hand over certain biometric data to the government in order to shave off a couple hours at the airport.
Sure.
And that seemed like something I was willing to do, but I also, you know, it's an issue of informed consent. Like, I knew what I was getting into. And so now all of a sudden when it's like, oh, we're also working with JetBlue and Delta, like, I have so many questions before I feel prepared to consent to that. What do you say to people who are like, well, I have nothing to hide? I really welcome this development. I'm doing like my weird Twitter troll voice. This is what people actually said on Twitter, which was like, what do you have to hide? I have nothing to hide.
I can really speak personally to that question, because up until very recently, I used to be one of these people. I used to be the kind of person that really didn't understand what the big deal with Edward Snowden was, what the big deal with Chelsea Manning was. I used to think like, well, shit, what the hell do I care if they have my stuff? I have nothing to hide. I don't care. If this makes us safer, like, I'm ready to relinquish my data to the government in order, for the purposes of national security.
But now you have something to hide?
Well, no, I don't. Oh, that's hilarious. No, that's not the implication of my change of heart. But that said, in the last 2 years, I've become more and more concerned about, you know, everything that we're talking about right now. Like, how much data do they have? What did I consent to? What have I accidentally consented to without knowing it? And it's caused more anxiety, like, for me, you know. And I've really started to see like what the main issue with Edward Snowden was and Chelsea Manning. It started to feel more personal. It used to feel really impersonal. I don't know. What I tell them is like, you just don't want someone up your ass like all the time. Like, I don't know. Like, they can't just
Not without my consent.
Everything that you know without your consent.
Correct.
They can't just know everything you do. It's so extremely violating of what you feel like are inalienable rights to your own space.
Privacy.
To privacy. I mean, listen, in this country in 2019, you can't go missing. You know, there used to be a time in I feel like in America's recent history where you could, like, you know, kind of fall off the face of the earth. I mean, you know, because you wanted to, not because like something bad happened to you or whatever. But you know what I mean?
Like the guy from Into the Wild, Chris McCandless,
exactly.
that just like dropped off the whatever.
If you had to disappear in America in 2019, you couldn't do it. But you should have the right to disappear if you wanted to disappear. And like, you just feel like that's just not your right anymore. And that's what I tell people.
I mean, I feel like the government needs to maybe take some like sex education classes about like the concept of enthusiastic consent.
Yeah.
Like, we can go forward together down this dystopian pathway, but only after I give enthusiastic informed consent, which I totally did not do.
No.
Right.
Shireen.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
Do we know what kind of programs specifically are being used to take the pictures?
No, we don't. And so I
Because-
did read up a little bit on this because like
Okay.
BuzzFeed News had a really good piece about this. So this was actually a program that the Obama administration signed into effect.
Thanks, Obama.
Right, exactly. And there was like no fire under it until recently. And then the Trump administration was like, oh, by the way, this needs to be implemented at all airports for international flights by the end of 2019. And so the actual implementation, it seems, is a little bit like piecemeal. Like, we're not sure what cloud servers they're using. It's probably Amazon or Microsoft, though.
But we know that those there are some really serious problems with those.
They're so shoddy.
Yes.
programs.
With what?
You know,
Yes.
We know that
Yes.
for minorities, for women, it's not accurate.
Well, that study that you're talking about with minorities was that I think the ACLU took this Amazon software and ran it against current members of Congress, and it returned something like 28 members of Congress were positively ID'd as having criminal records, and surprise, 40% of them were people of color.
Wow, surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
I feel like we're living in an era where like governments are making us feel like we need these technologies in order to like feel safe.
Fear-mongering.
There's so much like ambient fear around these days, like especially with the advent of like the war on terror and the ambient warfare that's like followed. Like we're just constantly like looking over our shoulders, thinking like that like terrorist boogeymen are about to like just mess everything up, and they make you feel like you need this surveillance.
Oh, definitely.
And it's safe, and it's better for you if your name's on a database, because maybe that would stop some bad man from doing something really bad, like 9/11. I don't know. That's like a leap. But like, you know what I'm saying? It's not even a leap.
It's not a leap because
you can
you can 100% track the rise in mobile technology to the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah.
That's when it started, because everybody needed a way to contact each other if something would have happened, because that was the big problem, because there was no way to get a hold of people that were on the ground, that were in the city, because if you were out and you didn't, no one had a cell phone, no one knew if you were dead or alive, right?
I mean, I also want to point out that like this, they may say that this is to keep us safer. However, I do question a couple things. I question the timing of this rollout, and I question the fact that this was a flight to Mexico. And I travel a lot internationally, and I see other people being like, yes, on my flight to London, like I was scanned too. But like it sort of dovetails very nicely with the administration's obsession about keeping Mexicans out of the country.
Agreed.
And when they first rolled out this test phase, I read that first it was like a Delta flight from Atlanta to Japan, and so they like got that technology, they got worked out some of the bugs, and then they immediately switched it on a flight to Mexico. And I have some questions
It
about
doesn't
it.
make any sense.
I mean, it makes perfect sense.
I mean, okay,
Were they just trying the
makes sense.
prototype of this technology on the Japan flight and then like rolling it out for like the official?
To me, it seems like a red herring, right? Where it's like, oh, this isn't about Mexicans. Like, we tried it on Japanese people.
Yeah, and that's always gone over great in American history.
Right, totally. Yeah. No historical problems with Japanese people, for sure.
None at
You know,
all.
to Shireen's point, too, about this, like, 80% success rate, another thing is that a human can adjust that success rate, right? So like if they want it to return a 95% success rate, that doesn't mean necessarily that they have updated the technology to be better. It means they've just set the thresholds for matches lower.
Right.
So like theoretically, it could return a 100% success rate, and some of those people would just be getting through
without accurate
actually-
IDs, which is effectively the same thing that happens right now with a printed boarding pass.
That's right.
Where you can just swap it with someone at the airport, and that's it.
Does anyone want to talk about this kid who's suing Apple? Have you guys read about this? Who was
recently said that the facial recognition technology at an Apple store mistook him for a different person who was stealing.
That's
from
correct.
Apple.
So somebody had been stealing Apple products, and they used his ID. It didn't have his photo on it. But apparently he says that Apple then like programmed his information, including a photo, which they obtained from somewhere, into their system, and then he was apprehended for additional thefts. And Apple says that they don't use facial recognition cameras in their stores, but he's like, well, then how did I get misidentified?
Oh, and Apple's so slimy because
So
I feel
shady.
like they're the ones that are always like, we don't like stalk you. We're not invasive. Like we believe in privacy for our customers. Like that's a tagline on their website that I see all the time when I'm like looking at it. Right? I mean, and for them to do something like this and be so, what's the word? I mean, hypocritical sounds a little bit like, I mean, everything's hypocritical, but it's really like, it feels like kind of a low blow. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much involved there, and it just brings back, like, to the original point from the beginning. That's like the minute that a company stands to make a profit from your personal data, there's a conflict.
All right. Well, thank you guys for talking through this with me. I am continually terrified by every new news story about how facial recognition technology is being used in ways that we didn't even know about. And I'm glad that we're all in this together.
Love to be scared.
Yeah.
Collective
God, we
fear.
have each other.
It's the best kind of fear.
Thanks, you guys. Until next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for having us.